I'm Dave.
And I'm Andrew, and we are the IB English guys. And today we were going to look at another text type in preparation for paper one. Today we're looking at a speech.
Yeah, we love speeches. Speeches are powerful. We love to listen to speeches and watch speeches. And this particular speech has incredible power. We want to think about the tools of persuasion that speakers use.
Indeed, Mr. Giles. Thinking about those tools, if you look down, you'll see a document down there. We just want to go over some of the major conventions of this particular text type. You'll see that, of course, the rhetorical triangle, we've got ethos, pathos, and logos. Let's start with ethos, Mr. Giles. Tell us a little bit about how one appeals to ethos.
Yeah, ethos is the credibility of the speaker, how the speaker is fostering that relationship with his or her audience and establishes credibility. And that's important. That's Indeed. What ethos is.
Moving forward to pathos, and this time you're going to be looking at emotions. How does the audience respond emotionally to the language choices made by the speaker? What emotions are they trying to evoke through their words? Think about that. Pathos.
And of course, logos is that logic and reasoning, the use of evidence, the use of logical ideas, the use of maybe statistics or stories that provide that sort of logical reasoning that's an important part of persuading us.
Yeah, and another thing that often gets overlooked when thinking about persuasion, Mr. Giles, is this notion of modality. And basically modality is a fancy way of saying what is the degree of certainty embedded in the words. Look at words such as must, might, should, and think about that degree of certainty and strength and what the implications are for the audience.
Yeah, we like that. I think, again, that's coming into vogue a little bit in terms of that sort of paper one writing. We also we want to look at the structure of the speech as a whole. And we want to think about how the speaker is beginning the speech, what kinds of structural moves they're making throughout the speech, and again, how that concludes. And this is, again, how the whole piece is put together.
Indeed, and you look at how the whole piece is put together, sometimes, Mr. Giles, you want to look at the structure of an individual sentence. You might want to look for things like antithesis, chiasmus, parallel structure. These are smaller things at the sentence level, but they're very carefully designed by the speaker to have maximum impact.
Right, and then lastly, the sort of category is thinking about language moves. We want to think about the use of language. Maybe they're using figurative language. What are they doing with words that have different connotations? Are they using some kind of symbolism? Are they having anecdotes or drawing analogies? These are the many ways that we use language to persuade. So those are an overview of some key features of speeches.
If you look down, you'll also see another document that has many more terms and other persuasive features. You can look at that as well. But today we just wanted to give you a preview of some of the maybe 10 really important conventions. What do you say we move on to the speech, Mr. Giles?
Let's go. We're going to read it aloud, and then we're going to talk about it. This speech is from Malcolm X. It was delivered in February of 1965. Malcolm X is a powerful black activist that was really an advocate for black empowerment during a time of lots of unrest during the civil rights movement.
Indeed. This is a time where you have very powerful speakers like Martin Luther King Jr. Talking about nonviolence, but Malcolm X had a different idea. He felt that it was the responsibility of African Americans to defend themselves in the face of oppression.
That's right. That's right. So here's his speech, and again, this is a powerful moment of history, and sadly, he was assassinated a week after this speech was
1 week
delivered.
after this speech, Mr. Giles. Tragic, absolutely tragic for the African American community. What do you say we read this aloud?
Okay. I was in a house last night that was bombed, my own. It isn't something that made me lose confidence in what I'm doing because my wife understands and I have children, and even in their young age, they understand. I think they would rather have a father who will take a stand in the face of any kind of reaction from narrow-minded people rather than to compromise and later on have to grow up in shame and disgrace.
Whenever you and I are discussing our problems, we need to be very objective, very cool, calm, collected.
But that doesn't mean we always should be. There's a time to be cool and a time to be hot.
There's a time to love and a time to hate.
I'm not a racist in any form whatsoever. I don't believe in any form of racism. I don't believe in any form of discrimination or segregation. I believe in Islam. I'm a Muslim, and there's nothing wrong with being a Muslim, nothing wrong with the religion of Islam.
The yardstick that is used by the Muslim to measure another man is not the man's color, but the man's deeds, the man's conscious behavior, the man's intentions. And when you use that as a standard of measurement or judgment, you never go wrong. I'm not in a society that practices brotherhood. I'm in a society that might preach it on Sunday, but they don't practice it on any day. It is a society controlled primarily by racists and segregationists who are in positions of power. They exercise forms of brutal oppression against dark-skinned people in any place on this earth where they're trying to exploit and oppress. They are violent when their interests are at stake.
But when you and I want just a little bit of freedom, we're supposed to be nonviolent.
They're violent.
But when it comes time for you and me to protect ourselves against lynchings, they tell us to be nonviolent. That's a shame. And when somebody stands up and talks just like I did, they say, "Why is he advocating violence?" Isn't that what they say?
I saw on television where they took this black woman down in Selma, Alabama, knocked her right down on the ground, dragging her down the street. You saw it. You're trying to pretend like you didn't see it, because you know you should have done something about it and didn't. It showed the sheriff and his henchmen throwing this black woman on the ground, and Negro men standing around doing nothing about it, saying, "Well, let's overcome them with our capacity to love."
What kind of phrase is that?
Overcome them with our capacity to love.
And then it disgraces the rest of us because all over the world the picture is splashed showing a black woman with some white brutes with their knees on her holding her down and full-grown black men standing around watching it.
You can't ever reach a man if you don't speak his language.
If a man speaks the language of brute force, you can't come up to him with peace. Why, good night. He'll break you in two, as he has been doing all along. If a man speaks French, you can't speak to him in German. If he speaks Swahili, you can't communicate with him in Chinese. You have to find out what this man speaks. And once you know his language, learn how to speak his language, he'll get the point. There'll be some dialogue.
You know the language the Klan speaks.
It is a duty. It is yours and my duty as human beings. It is our duty to our people to organize ourselves and let the government know that if they don't stop the Klan, we'll stop ourselves. We'll stop it ourselves. So I don't believe in violence. That's why I want to stop it.
And you can't stop it with love. So we only mean vigorous action in self-defense, and that vigorous action we feel we're justified in initiating by any means necessary. The press call us racist and people who are violent in reverse. This is how they psycho you. They make you think that if you try to stop the Klan from lynching you, you're practicing violence in reverse.
I hear a lot of you parrot, "I don't want to be a Ku Klux Klan in reverse." Well, if a criminal comes around your house with his gun, it doesn't make you a robber because you grab your gun and run him out.
The press calls us racist in reverse. Why, this is insane. With skillful manipulating, they're able to make the victim look like the criminal and the criminal look like the victim. That's crazy.
If you tell them what's now in store, they'll think you're crazy for sure. But this year will be the longest and hottest and bloodiest year of them all. It has to be. Not because you want it to be, or I want it to be, or we want it to be, but because the conditions that created those explosions are still here. The conditions are still here.
You can't say that you're not going to have an explosion when you leave the conditions. The ingredients still here.
As long as those ingredients, explosive ingredients, remain, then you're going to have the potential for explosion on your hands.
Mr. Giles, that's a really powerful speech, of course, delivered by Malcolm X 1 week before his assassination.
Yeah.
Very serious topic. What do you say we break this down and talk about it?
Yeah, let's do that. We're going to talk about big ideas and look through and talk about the speech, periodically mentioning some of the features of the text. And again, you'll see a complete response about this text.
To start off, Mr. Giles, I noticed that Malcolm X starts off with a really powerful anecdote, and he talks about what happened to him last night. And he uses this lexical cluster by talking about his wife and his children and his other family members to really shock the audience and show them that, hey, I'm just like you deal with violence, I deal with it as well, and I dealt with it last night.
Yeah, this builds his ethos for sure. And then again, he's got that link to himself, but also to the audience. He's talking about you, I, and we. And using those pronouns, he's connecting him with his audience, which is generally African Americans who he's really trying to speak to.
Yeah, and I think after that, Mr. Giles, thinking of his audience of African Americans, he wants to sort of contrast his message with the other messages out there. So he's going to start using this juxtaposition. A time to be hot and a time to be cool, a time to love and a time to hate. And I think he's sort of planting the seeds that his notion of how to deal with discrimination is not the same as Martin Luther King and other people who preach nonviolence.
Yeah, that's some powerful structural moves there. I love the parallel
Indeed.
structure. So then again, he's making an allusion to religion here, and he's really talking about his roots in Islam. He says, I believe in Islam, I am a Muslim. We see these short sentences, really impactful. And then he talks about the yardstick that we define a Muslim by. Again, this is very powerful where he's drawing that metaphor and talking about Islam measuring another man not by his color, but by his deeds.
Of course, this is interesting as well. If you know a little bit about the context, of course, Martin Luther King also had a lot of religious illusions, but his were, grounded in Christianity, while Malcolm X is grounding hers in Islam. Very interesting comparison. Once he's sort of talked about religion and how it allows him to it can be used as a yardstick to measure the difference between oppressors and those who are on the same side. I think he moves on to talk about some irony, and he looks about sort of in his opinion, the irony of nonviolence. Why is that ironic, Mr. Giles?
The irony of nonviolence?
Well, in this case, he says, we're supposed to be nonviolent.
Yeah, so he's criticizing that idea that they're asking us to be nonviolent when they're being violent to us, and he's really calling that out. And he says this is not how we should be doing it, because he's again making those allusions to the horrible the lynchings that they've endured. And again, this is that connection to what's happening.
Yeah, he continues with those allusions by talking about Selma, what happened to the woman, and then he actually challenges the audience through a rhetorical question. He says, talking about them, this idea of loving the oppressor, he says, what kind of phrase is that? I think he's directly challenging his audience at that point.
Yeah, just to not this idea of overcoming them with our capacity to love. He doesn't agree with that. And again, he's speaking some strong language, and then he refers to talking to a person by speaking the language. And again, he's using a metaphor here, comparing the language of violence. He's like, if someone's speaking to me in the language of violence, then I will use that same language. And he draws an analogy of speaking different languages.
Well,
that's
because
powerful.
And he talks about we, meaning he and his audience, they know the language of the Klan. And then he sort of takes the you and the my and the word duty and talks about how collectively it's their duty to not let this continue.
That's right. And this is, again, that repetition of the word duty and that repetition of the call to action. And then again, he's talking about the sort of vigorous action that's required. This is what we need to do.
Vigorous action. Not fighting, vigorous action. Interesting use of euphemism there.
Yeah, I think it's super powerful. And again, he's drawing attention to the criticisms of we don't want to be the same. We don't want to be Ku Klux Klan in reverse. And he's making a reference to that.
I think this speech ends with some foreshadowing, and it's quite an ominous ending, Mr. Giles. Can you talk a little bit about where this is going with the metaphor of the explosion there at the end?
Yeah, he's talking about this explosion is bound to happen because the ingredients are still there. And again, it's quite prophetic because the violence that he's talking about, was brewing there, right? And
indeed. And again, as we mentioned earlier, sadly, he gets assassinated a week later.
That's
Folks,
right.
Just to remind you of the guiding question that you'll be working on for your homework, the question is, how does the speaker employ rhetorical techniques to provoke the audience to take action? Okay, so we want to think about those rhetorical techniques and how he asks the audience to take action. Think about that, draft up your answer, and come back in. In the next video, we'll show you another student answer. You can compare your response to that response and see how you did.
Yeah, this is a powerful speech, and there's more to talk about than you could possibly talk about, but I think there's so much great language to talk about, and it's so persuasive.
Yeah, so in closing, folks, I believe this is video 7? I don't know. This is part of our 20 video series. So come on back, watch the next one, and we'll take you to May and make sure that you're successful on your Paper One endeavors. Thanks for joining, folks, and take care.
Thanks, guys.